A full day coming up at the Los Angeles Times Festival of the Book. Steve Wasserman is with us. Mr. Wasserman, what is your role in the festival and what can people expect here?
Well, immodestly, I suppose I'd have to confess that my role is a kind of Saul Kirok to the Republic of Letters here in Los Angeles. I, along with my colleagues at the Los Angeles Times, are responsible for the programming at the festival, for its editorial content.
And on a weekly basis, you do what?
On a weekly basis, I preside over that weekly festival of books known as the Los Angeles Times Book Review.
And how healthy is the book review?
The book review, despite the economy going south everywhere else, my employers expanded it by a third a year ago, so it's very, very healthy despite the paucity of advertising. Shame on the book publishing world. They don't know how many people love and read books here in Los Angeles and celebrate the written word.
Why did your newspaper begin this festival?
This festival was begun 8 years ago. It was the mad idea of a woman named Narda Zucchino, who had the odd idea that there were quite a lot of people who would get off their Stairmasters and get up out of their lap pools and come off the beach for books. And the first year, they expected maybe 25,000 people to show up. 3 times that number came. Today, we have probably an estimated 170,000 people attending it on this last weekend in April.
In this upcoming panel discussion, you are going to moderate a discussion on the topic of the day, the war in Iraq. Why have a panel like this?
Well, the panel, which will consist of Christopher Hitchens, who is the Eye of Stone Fellow at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism and the author of several books and of an upcoming book about the war in Iraq, and is probably the finest polemicist of his generation, along with Robert Scheer, a syndicated columnist for the Los Angeles Times, and Samantha Power, whose book, A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide, has just won the Pulitzer Prize, and Mark Danner, who also teaches at the UC School of Journalism at Berkeley and contributed to the New Yorker and the New York Review of Books. Well, what could be more timely than to engage this complicated set of issues which sees the United States taking an unprecedented role in the affairs of the Middle East?
There have been a lot of panels like this. What are you going to try to make this one different?
Well, we're going to try to explore, insofar as we're humanly capable, without the usual jargon and the posturing, with a degree of sobriety and seriousness, a level of conversation that goes against the grain of the coarseness that too often deforms debate on these issues in this country.
Steve Wasserman, thank you very much. We're going to take you inside this building right here, Haynes Hall, for the panel discussion on Iraq.
Before introducing our panelists, each of whom will make introductory remarks of about 5 minutes in duration each, then there'll be some rebuttal, and we'll have an exchange after that. Before introducing them, let me make a few remarks. This debate, this discussion, this exploration of issues that have attached themselves like so many barnacles to one of the most difficult and thorny questions before the Republic is entitled American Power and the War in Iraq. The hour that we have before us is too brief a time, of course, to explore in the depth that is truly required to explore the many issues that have pressed themselves so painfully and so acutely on the citizens of this country and indeed on citizens in nations all over the globe. But we will do our best to raise questions and to do what we can to challenge received opinion, to examine shibboleths and canards, and to, in some fashion, get at the truth of what is reported to us and what we have experienced over the past number of months, and indeed to try to explore in some interesting fashion what is unfolding before us and likely to unfold before us in the coming months and arguably years to come. The United States and its coalition partner, Great Britain, are in Mesopotamia, having, for the moment, won the brief 28-day war in about half the time as it took to expel Saddam Hussein's troops from the occupation of Kuwait 12 or 13 years ago. The regime of Saddam Hussein is no more. And one would have to possess a heart of stone not to have been stirred by many of the pictures that were beamed to us to see the palpable relief on the faces of a people who had been for many decades ground down and under by a despotic regime whose murderous intents have now been revealed to all of us. Whether or not, of course, the course set by the Bush administration was both justified and wise still imposes itself upon us and continues to be worth debating and thinking about, particularly as events are moving with great rapidity, and it seems clear that the United States, principally, has managed to accomplish what the Iranian regime, in the aftermath of the toppling of the Shah, so signally failed to do, which is to remove from power a secular thug and to permit a process of rearrangement in a country whose history is very brief. After all, it perhaps is germane to point out that the history of the Bechtel Corporation is a far longer one than even the modern state of Iraq. Let us begin with the proposition that this course was both justified and wise, and let us try to ask the question, can the peace be kept? Can it be constructed? Is it wise to do so? Are there larger principles at work having to do with unilateral preemption and the rule of law? And let us think about those questions with as much sobriety as we can muster, and to free ourselves of as much rhetoric and cant as we are humanly capable of. That process and that debate has been too rare in a culture which has largely coarsened discussion of these important issues. Let me introduce first Christopher Hitchens, who is the I.F. Stone Fellow at the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism, a columnist for Vanity Fair, and arguably one of the most gifted polemicists of his generation. Oh, he points out that I've neglected to mention that he's the author of many books, including a book which you have yet to read, but which is at the press now, entitled The Long Short War, The Postponed Liberation of Iraq, which will be in bookstores throughout the country on June 9th.
Thank you, sir. That's much better. You can sit there. You'd rather do it here?
Thank you, Steve. Sorry for the prompt. I guess thank you for the arguably as well. Good morning, good day, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming, brothers and sisters, comrades and friends. This feels like Groundhog Day to me. I think this is the third or fourth time that I've appeared with some version of this panel on this subject. Though I'm glad to say that today, instead of the impossibly handsome and laconic features of Michael Ignatieff, we have instead the impossibly tempestuous features of Samantha Power. So I feel to that extent redeemed from the groundhog condemnation. Christos Anesti, to any of you who happen to be Greek and celebrating Easter today, I want to begin at an oblique angle to the subject. On Thursday last, the partition line of barbed wire and rubble that has separated the Greek and Turkish peoples of Cyprus by a full-fledged NATO occupation, colonization, and semi-annexation by Turkey for now upwards of a quarter of a century, that had imposed a completely apartheid colonial system on the people of Cyprus. It was as a result of a coup and an invasion, both of them the brainchilds of Mr. Henry Kissinger. This border fell down. Hasn't been reported yet in the local media, it seems to me. I've been looking for reports of it. I now know much more about the Peterson family than I ever wanted to know. But nothing about the extraordinary fact that the last divided capital city in the world, and the last one in Europe, Nicosia, is divided no more. It seems that the Turkish authorities on Thursday, in a sense, surrendered. They gave up. They said the border is open. Greek Cypriots who I know have been going back to homes they thought they would never see again, and trying to recover cultural treasures that they thought were irretrievably lost. And even more hearteningly, many Turkish Cypriots are making their way south to apply for Cyprus identity cards, redefining their nationality as Cypriot, not as Turkish or as products of a Turkish colonial occupation, and wanting a share in the future Europe of which Cyprus, Greek and Turkish, is about to become a member. I think that this is indissoluble, this wonderful moment, extraordinary moment of liberation, equally comparable, if not more so, to the fall of the Berlin Wall, as the recent Ozymandias events in Paradise Square in the center of Baghdad would qualify to be. I believe this to be indissoluble from what all of us in the campaign for the liberation of Iraq hoped and believed would be true, that by the inauguration of this process, a positive wind of change would indeed begin to blow throughout that region. It's very clear to me that the Turkish government, realizing that it has failed to prevent the emancipation of Iraq, failing even to profiteer from it by making an opportunistic move into Kurdistan, failing even to accept the bribe that was offered to uphold its own interests by our national security establishment, has been forced to make an essential concession and has begun to retreat from its policy of isolationism, colonialism, and military expansionism. This is an extraordinarily important fact, especially when you remember that when we were last met, we of this panel, about a month ago, it was confidently predicted on all sides that Turkey would seize the territory of northern Iraq, would put an end to the experiment in Kurdish self-rule and autonomy, would project its power under the American umbrella deep into Iraq. That was only one of the many ridiculous, doom-laden predictions that one had to combat. To the contrary, the ratchet of emancipation works in the opposite direction. Kurdish autonomy, one of the most important causes of the movement for international human rights that there is, the largest minority in the world, the largest people in the world that don't have a state. Their autonomy in northern Iraq is now further guaranteed, underwritten, and expanded. And it's been met with this counterpart in Cyprus. It was also predicted about a month ago with even more confidence that General Sharon would seize this opportunity to cleanse the West Bank of its remaining Palestinian inhabitants and complete the process of ethnic cleansing. That this too would be an unfailing consequence of any attempt to end the use by Saddam Hussein of Iraq as his own personal torture chamber. Well, that didn't happen either. In fact, General Sharon now is having to have a much more serious discussion about his illegal colonial settlements than he's ever had to have with any previous United States administration. And this too, it seems to me, is the counterpart, is one of the other shoes that is dropping at the realization that there is nothing stable as well as nothing decent in a policy that relies on proxy rule, on client states, and on fascistic regimes. It's a great moment, in fact, and one that everyone should be proud of, that the United States has begun to discard the policy of the proxy state and the client regime, and has begun to say that whatever the risks, democracy is more stable and as well as more justifiable as an experiment. I think that's a moment every American ought to be very pleased about and pleased with. And the fact of the matter is, by an exercise of what Hegel once called, I'll plagiarize him for a second, the cunning of history, the United States has found itself at war with the forces of reaction. I'll say it again so you can relish it. The United States has found itself, by perhaps an exercise of the cunning of history, at war with the forces of reaction. This policy of regime change was opposed by the Saudi Arabian oligarchs, the people who helped to bring us Al-Qaeda. It was opposed by the Pakistani secret police and the dictatorship that helped bring us the Taliban, unalterably opposed to the policy of regime change. It was opposed by the Turkish establishment with its colonial adventures in Cyprus and its projected colonial adventures in Kurdistan. It's a challenge to what's long been an insufferable status quo. And I know I'm not going to need to rehearse for you the exhilarating effect that it's had for all the people of Iraq. Obviously now, if you want to get your story into the New York Times or the Washington Post or the LA Times, you have to know where to put the apostrophe in the word Shia or Shiite. They happen to be the story at the moment. This too is part of the long list of doom-laden predictions that I think will turn out to be false and will be falsified. There is, of course, a moment of revolution among the Shia population of Iran, but we haven't heard from innumerable other elements of that population yet, including the 4 million out of 22, 23 million Iraqis, gifted, talented, professional, qualified, and democratic, who've been forced by this horrendous regime to live outside their own country, and who can now return, bringing their skills and their experience of living in a democratic society. It's with these people we should be working. Those people who won't have time for many more mass anti-war demonstrations may be wondering what to do with the time that will be lying so heavily on their hands from now on. Well, I have some suggestions. They could raise some money to help the people who are restarting the free press in Baghdad. They could raise some money for the human rights groups who are going to be digging up the mass graves and breaking open the secret prisons and tearing open the torture chambers. They could sponsor the families of some of the thousands and tens of thousands of missing Iraqis and Kurds who are going to want help finding their families or finding at least what happened to them. There's going to be plenty of work for everybody to do. And I think it's high time that the American human rights community helped to put Iraq at the top of its list of priorities in that respect. One more minute. I'll just make two closing points there if I've only 60 seconds. In 1990, the reason why my book is called The Long Short War, and the reason I wanted it to be introduced under that title, is that what we've just seen is not the end of a 28-day war, but the end of a 13-year one, which began in 1990, when Saddam Hussein actually abolished the existence of a neighboring Arab and Muslim state, annexed Kuwait entirely to Iraq. In the year 1990, he had a choice. He could either invade Kuwait before or just after he acquired a nuclear weapon, which the inspectors had then failed to find. They didn't find his nuclear weaponry till afterwards. The only self-criticism Saddam Hussein has ever made in his entire life is to say, I probably should have finished work on the nuke before I took over the whole of Kuwait. That's how self-critical he can be on a good day. Well, now he hasn't got Kuwait, and he hasn't got the bomb, and he's never going to find out what it's like to have weapons of mass destruction. He did make an alliance with the forces of jihad, openly appealing to them, openly training them, the bin Ladenist forces in Kurdistan and in southern and central Iraq. We found them. They were almost the only people willing to fight for him. So we know the terror connection is proved, because that alliance between them didn't start the day before yesterday, comrades, I can promise you that. And we will, though it's taken 13 years far too long, 12 of those years really were eaten by the locust in Iraq. Finally, the job is very nearly completed, and all it remains for me to recommend, I think, in closing, is that we give the inspections more time. Thank you.
In the interest of maximizing the amount of time that each panelist will have, I respectfully ask each of them to remain at their current posts. Let me introduce to you Mark Danner, who is a professor of international relations at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism, the author of The Massacre at El Mozote, an extraordinary work of investigative reportage about the depredations that occurred in Central America in the early 80s. He is also the author of a forthcoming book called The Saddest Story, America, the Balkans, and the Post-Cold War World. He's a contributor to the New York Review of Books. Mark Danner.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for coming. This is indeed a Groundhog Day moment. Christopher and I have shared this stage now. I think this is the third time, and I am profoundly sad that I have thus far apparently failed to convince him of my arguments. But today he will have a further choice, or a further opportunity to be convinced. He said that the work is nearly completed in Iraq, and I would say that this is definitely not the end. It's not the end of the beginning. It's not the beginning of the end, excuse me, and it is perhaps near the end of the beginning. We've perhaps reached that. We're at the beginning of an occupation. We are at the beginning of a political project that must, as we always knew, follow the military project. And it leaves in front of us two main questions. Can the United States establish a lasting, stable, democratic political order in Iraq that is favorable to American interests? And second, the wind, the lovely wind that Christopher spoke about, where will that wind blow next? That is, what are the implications for American foreign policy and America's role in the world of the Iraqi intervention and of the other interventions that are currently being discussed at the highest levels of government, privately and, I would say, in recent days, very, very publicly. I think we are all blessed in that we're living in a plastic time. That is, things are changing, things are being reshaped. It happened first after the First World War, with the decision of the United States not to join the League of Nations. Second, in the late 40s, when the institutions of NATO, Marshall Plan, the United Nations, and others were set up, by which the United States led a struggle against the Soviet Union for half a century as leader of an alliance system. And it's happening now again, where you see the United States essentially demolishing a good deal of that alliance system and a good deal of that multilateral system and changing to the politics of unilateralism, hegemonic, unilateral, and very much reliant on military force. The question before all of us, and the one that we can, the answer to which we can follow every day in our newspapers, presumably on the front page, perhaps on the inside pages, is can the United States establish a new order in the vacuum that it has created in Iraq? The dictatorship has been destroyed, a national security state that for 30 years has dominated the politics of Iraq, that has either exported or killed political competition and political opposition. It no longer exists. There is to some degree a tabula rasa, but there are political elements that we have already seen come to the fore in recent days, and that I would wager will come much more to the fore in the next weeks. One is the Shia structure of politics on the ground, which has already had for the first time in 30 years its yearly pilgrimage to Karbala, and has already begun staging demonstrations in the capital and elsewhere against the United States. We have in Iraq a situation similar to that, for all its differences, in Haiti after 1986, and in other countries we can think of after the end of despotism. That is, a new political universe is being born. We have planets, suns, constellations, wheeling off into space. We'll have newspapers, we'll have political parties, we'll have political groupings, we'll have alliances, and each of these political groupings will be trying to gain, to look for lucrative political issues. And the United States very quickly has already actually become the main political issue in the country. That is, we're trying to create a democracy, a democratic system, or at least we say we are, under the shadow, the inevitable shadow of nationalism. It is as if we're trying to do delicate work under our own shadow in the darkness. And that shadow of nationalism will become more and more prominent, I think, in the days and weeks ahead. The key problem in the Middle East, which we're going to confront, I think, and the problem raised by Christopher's talk, is if indeed we have been, over the years, for democracy in the Middle East, why are there no democracies there? And since there are no democracies there, why is it that we support and have continued to support autocracies, both by your tax dollars for military defense of the regime in the Gulf, the regime in Saudi Arabia, or by direct foreign aid in the case of Egypt, as well as other places, $3 billion a year? And the answer to that, I think, is rather simple, which is that the autocratic rulers of those states are favorable to American interests, or at least appear to be so, and the people, increasingly, are not. We are about to confront that issue and that paradox in all its glory in Iraq. That is, if the democratic order that we claim we support and that we claim to want to create is indeed created, it risks very much being an order that will be anti-American and certainly anti-American policy in the Middle East, and with respect especially to Israel and the Palestinians. A few days ago, Donald Rumsfeld simply said, when asked, what if a Shiite regime takes power contrary to American interests, he simply laid down the line, that will not happen. Again, there's an obvious paradox there when we talk about our ideas about democracy. I will prophesy that in the next weeks and months we will have incidents involving American troops who must be in the role of enforcing security in Iraq, involving demonstrations, involving other security matters that will make the United States front and center the main political interest in that, the main political issue in the nascent politics of that country. One of the surprising things over the past weeks has been, well, among other things, there were no flowers and sweets greeting us in the streets. But the second, most surprising thing, it seems to me, is that the United States was very unprepared for the occupation itself, and that a number of decisions that had to be made before it, most obviously how the country would be secured, how Americans would protect public buildings, how Americans would apply security in the main cities, and finally, what political order America would support, what would be its policy, for example, toward the Iraqi National Congress and Ahmed Shalabi. Those questions were not resolved within the government. They're still being fought over. We will see now the cost of this indecision. I think we'll also see the costs of the fact that the Pentagon is going to run this occupation. And the political mastermind, Donald Rumsfeld, it seems, will be the public face of this occupation. The Pentagon is not known for its political sophistication. It is known for its military prowess. And that the United Nations, partly as a result of the wounds that still remain from the pre-war diplomatic fight, is going to be kept out of things. So we see the continuing cost of this struggle.
Thank you, Mark. And now we'll turn to Samantha. Let me introduce Samantha Power, a professor at the Kennedy School of Government and a founder of the Carr Center for Human Rights at Harvard University, and the author of an indispensable volume on our current predicament, both the recent past, the present, and the likely future, called A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide, for which she was just awarded the Pulitzer Prize.
I don't know, still when I hear those words, it sounds about as unfamiliar as being told I've just won the Cy Young.
She'd rather have won the Cy Young.
I'd perhaps rather have won the Cy Young. A lot of people ask, because one of the chapters of the book is on the atrocities that Christopher went and explored firsthand in northern Iraq, the genocide that Saddam committed against the Kurds, the gassing, the destruction of the villages, the attempted eradication of rural Kurds in northern Iraq in 87, 88. How it could be that I could have been so skeptical about this war. And so I'd just like to begin by sketching sort of some of the reasons, I think all of which raise questions not only about the future of Iraq, but also, as Mark has suggested, about the future of American power, and also crucially, and something that we all have to take into account, the future of international institutions, because we seem to fall prey to a kind of romanticizing impulse when it comes to international institutions that I think those of us who experienced the Bosnia conflict should be wary of, but that's what happens when one ends up so skeptical about the motives and the plans of the administration. First reason, of course, to be skeptical about the war was just the loss of life, and here we can be grateful that it was mercifully quick. I do think that we all fall prey to a tendency to kind of write off deaths to Iraqi soldiers on the grounds that they are legitimate combatants. But I think, again, one of the questions this war raises, and any war against theocratic fascism or dictatorship or whatever does raise the forces of reaction, is when soldiers are gang-pressed often into service, should we be so consoled when the tens of thousands of lives lost are those of soldiers? So I just think it's a question worth raising and that's still with us. Second point, and this I think is really challenging for all of us, is, you know, again, there was a genocide committed by this man. I mean, if not there, then where, it seems to me, from a human rights standpoint. And I'm not Michael Ignatieff, but this was, I think, the argument that he made sitting in this spot a month ago. I felt that that the danger, and this just sounds like parsing, but that it was not a mortal danger and nor an immediate danger to the Kurds or to citizens of Iraq, and I'm sure Christopher will weigh in on this later, but that there was an argument that could be made for a punitive intervention 12 years later. There was an argument for preventive intervention, because God knows once one has committed acts like that, one is capable of doing it again. But that without the mortal immediate threat to life, your default toward multilateral sanction should remain in place. In other words, toward that requirement. And so this is intense formalism, though. And I think those of us who wanted, you know, a UN Security Council resolution quietly blinded ourselves to the lunacy of having Russia and China be the arbiters of our principles when it comes to human rights. And I don't think we take that fact very seriously. And I think as while we have good reason for turning to the Security Council, because they are the only guardians of legitimate, so-called legitimate and/or legal action. They are the only guardians of our order, and so it's one-stop shopping. It's the only place to go. But there is a tension built into this when it comes to actually them being the determinants of when that direct and mortal and immediate threat is actually posed. Thirdly, we of course had great skepticism about the human rights motives of individuals within this administration. Now, of course, the chapter in my book that is on Iraq documents how many of the officials who made today's policy were, in fact, of course, famously, legendarily, aligned with Saddam at the time that he was using chemical weapons against his own people. And indeed, our generous aid package to his regime, which was $500 million a year in agricultural credits in 1988, while the genocide was being carried out, was actually doubled the year after to more than $1 billion in agricultural credits. So I think one could be forgiven at being quite skeptical, despite the sort of conversion ethos in Washington around morality and human rights and freedom and even nation building, that one was sort of worried about how, if in the scratch and sniff model, how deep these commitments actually sort of went. Now, again, in terms of what that leaves us with today, I think we can still, and one of the reasons, by the way, to be concerned about motives is that is not for epistemological reasons or because good intention is a priori, you know, the only thing that one can look for in order to judge good results and or even in the end, retrospectively, even maybe a just war, not in the traditional just war theory, of course. But it's that it actually tells you a lot. People's motives tell you a lot about the means that they're going to employ, as Mark was saying, the priorities that they're going to make as the war itself is being conducted, and of course the capacity for follow-through and the tenor of follow-through. So you look to motives actually more as a proxy for what you're going to see later. Now the good news, potentially, is that because weapons are proving kind of hard to find, the human rights and the freedom argument has, from day one, really, it was announced as Operation Iraqi Freedom, not Operation Iraqi Disarm. And the fewer weapons one finds, the more the freedom argument becomes the retrospective justification, of course, for the war. And it was a factor, it has to be said. It was one factor among several, but it was a small factor. And I don't think there's anyone in the administration who would have said, I mean, Christopher would be the person who would say it was the genocide alone that normatively that, you know, should have sent us there. But I don't think there's anybody, even the most sort of freedom-spewing members of this administration, who would say with a straight face that it was simply because of that we went there. So we have this issue, though, that now it is at the centerpiece of American rhetoric and retrospective justification, and may remain that. But let's ask the question of maybe that can do some good. Maybe there is now some cognitive dissonance that can be experienced by members of this administration as they continue to conduct business as usual with other repressive regimes. And I do think also, to Mark's point about follow-through, it is going to get harder and harder, we were talking about this yesterday, to lose face and to do the hit-and-run version of nation building, which of course has been the American temptation in both Afghanistan and in the Balkans. So I think that one could be very skeptical about the rhetoric coming out of the administration. It actually has entailed an investment of American credibility and prestige. It may be an investment that we can figure out a way to spin our way out of eventually when the costs become too high. But I think that one has to look perhaps to some ripple effect on other policies with other repressive regimes and demand it, of course. And then just two more points in closing. One of the other questions of the reasons that we were skeptical, of course, was this point about a fear of staying power in Iraq. You know, would we just go in, maybe, you know, do regime change, get out, leave the Iraqi people to their fate, having long privileged order over justice, were we now going to go in, you know, get our version of order tended to and leave disorder to prevail in the country? Here it's very tricky, of course, because the administration is such a balancing act now, because on the one hand, they can't stay too long, because that's just confirmation of all the worst motives of empire and, you know, land grab and oil grab and all the rest. On the other hand, they can't leave tomorrow, because then they'll be subject to the understandable criticism that they've opened up this Pandora's box and then left people to their own devices. So I think that we all have to ask ourselves questions, now that the deed has been done and we have inherited this mess, exactly how do we get this balance right, sort of like Goldilocks. You know, you can't stay too long, you can't stay too short. What is, you know, that period that is the right period where we can actually hand off? Again, I want to stress, though, we are very prone to romanticize both the United Nations as a sort of peacekeeping enforcement force and other member states who themselves, believe me, if they could have gotten that Bechtel contract, they too would have made a lunge in that direction. So we come back again and again to some very structural problems in the international order in terms of states being the guardians of the principles that we think that we hold dear. And then finally, and I hope if we get more time to talk more about this, but the main reason that I came down, ultimately it plunked, as Michael Walzer says, against the war, was just the fear that while it would make Iraq a more humane place, that it would make the world a much more dangerous place. And I don't think that we have grappled with the way that we have forfeited our legitimacy as the guardians of these principles. And I think this administration is committed to the idea that it's more important to be feared than to be liked. And I would just say that the strength of American history is actually a testament to the fact that it's much more important to be respected than to be either feared or liked. It's nice to, being feared is important, and the use of hard power is an essential part of this war on terrorism, but to minimize the value of America's so-called soft power and its ability to make others want what we want, I think is to really lose sight of recent history. And right now, people want to want what we don't want, and that's dangerous. Thank you.
I'd like to introduce now Robert Scheer, the USC clinical professor at the USC Annenberg School for Communication, the author of numerous books, including America After Nixon, The Age of the Multinationals, With Enough Shovels, Reagan, Bush, and Nuclear War, and the serious but somewhat mischievously titled book, Thinking Tuna Fish, Talking Death, Essays on the Pornography of Power, and a syndicated columnist for the Los Angeles Times.
Every time a institution is connected with my name, they want to fire me. So my connection with USC is quite tenuous. I teach a class. I'm a syndicated columnist who, fortunately, the LA Times runs. I thank them. I don't speak for them or USC or anyone else for that. Even my own wife disagrees with me profoundly. So I just want to be clear about that. I've also learned from these exchanges that it takes a great deal of courage to support the administration if you're in the media, and it's an act of cowardliness to criticize the administration. I learned this in our last debate. I've learned this from the thousands of emails that I get. And I just want to disabuse people. I am not an Islamic fanatic, and that was not the reason for my criticizing the war. However, clearly our panel here is unexpectedly unbalanced. I thought we would have more of an administration point of view, so I would like to take that position and defend it. We said that we have to go against Saddam Hussein because, after all, we've been attacked in the most devious attack of September 11th, and we couldn't be indifferent to it. And we fortunately had this ally of Pakistan that some people had thought had been behind the Taliban and al-Qaeda, but we wanted to cease punishing them for their nuclear weapons, so we dropped the sanctions. and we needed them, so we couldn't be mean with the Pakistanis, and we certainly couldn't be mean with the Saudis, even though 15 of the hijackers came from Saudi Arabia, because we get along so well with them, and they play ball with us. And so what did we have? We had Saddam Hussein. And we had, fortunately, bulletproof evidence, to use Donald Rumsfeld's words. Bulletproof. I don't know what bulletproof means to you, but to me, I would think it's a pretty strong case that Saddam Hussein was behind September 11th. Not behind some terrorist you find in the U.S. patrolled area of Iraq or down by Iran, but behind, Saddam Hussein was behind it. And since it would be an act of disloyalty, according to people like O'Reilly and others, to question the administration, let me tell you, I expect Donald Rumsfeld to produce that bulletproof evidence just at any hour. And I will applaud him for it. And I must tell you, every single weekend now, I have spent the weekend looking for weapons of mass destruction. Because every single weekend there is a story on CNN or somewhere else that they've been found. And they're going to be tested, and they're going to be proved. And in fact, for all respect one has for the New York Times, this is what Judith Miller said last Monday. Then I read New York Times on Tuesday. Where were they? Where are those little corrections or something? Wednesday, oh, well, they weren't there, but there was a guy cited, and they may have had some chemicals that are, and now the current theory seems to be we'll never find them, but they're in the minds of people. Well, those things you can find in any search on the internet. You can find all the ideas. In fact, the guy who did the anthrax in Washington, whom we've all forgotten about, was evidently using U.S. materials and probably was part of our defense establishment. However, having said that, I still think we'll find these weapons of mass destruction because the president said so as recently as yesterday, and it would be unpatriotic to suggest that the president might be lying to us because we live in a democracy that we want to be the model of the world. So why would the president lie to us when he's building a model for the entire world? It would not make sense at all. Then we have the real weapons of mass destruction, the nuclear ones, the ones we no longer care that Pakistan has and others. And okay, that was a harder case to make because nuclear weapons, as you know, can pretty easily be detected and so forth. They give off all kinds of signals. You have to get a lot of equipment. You don't do it in your kitchen, as with some of these other weapons. But fortunately, we were able to find the properly forged documents to make the case. And when you're up against a particularly evil enemy, you have to forge documents. That's one of the things you do. And I disagree with Hans Blix that it's sort of surprising that our CIA and the British intelligence did not know that these were crude forgeries. I think these people are trained to not notice crude forgeries. And as a result, they just passed it on as our own work and so forth. So the nuclear weapons issue, I'm sure, again, we will find. There's this massive cache. And I looked today again, but they didn't show up. The other thing that we have about this whole question of our posture and the model, because let's face it, there's a serious point to be made here. You don't take over these countries unilaterally and not have a responsibility. I think that's the point that was made. Whether we like it or not, we are in this thing that George W. Bush condemned, nation building, okay? And if we don't do the nation building, we're going to have lots of al-Qaedas, because that's what happened in Afghanistan. We supported the Mujahideen. We said these were freedom fighters. Ronald Reagan had a day of celebration every year for the freedom fighters. Freedom fighters morphed into the Taliban. Taliban morphed into al-Qaeda. They didn't like us so much. And we have this problem. So we know there's no walking away from Iraq. And also we committed what I think for colonialists is a cardinal sin. We actually said these people are important. You know, they're not just going to be house servants. But they're going to be democratic, and their rights are important. And heresy of heresies, they should actually control their own oil, and it should be used for their betterment. This is the most radical notion of the last 50 years, that the resources of these countries should be used for the betterment of the people. My God, if you apply that to Oakland or Los Angeles, you're really going to have a revolution here. There is no easy walking away from that. And so then the question really becomes absolutely critical, what model of democracy? And again, I think we've set a very good example. We've said the model of democracy that works, and I think this is what Rumsfeld was referring to when he said if they vote for this kind of Islamic state, forget it, they're not going to have it. The model of democracy we're advocating is where you always vote correctly. And if you don't, then you fudge a few votes and win in Florida, and then you're president. Or as please don't clap, because then my friend Hitchens, who I've known for many years, will accuse me of throwing red meat to the mob. And you know, people supporting your argument means your argument is invalid. I learned that from our last debate. But
One more minute.
1 more minute. Okay, but I think that the critical thing here, the critical lesson is what really was the lesson. This is a country that once believed in the League of Nations, World, UN, and everything, and I think it goes to the previous point. We said that we can smash the United Nations, we can smash multilateralism, we can smash that vision of the New World Order, the expanded NATO and everything, because they did not vote our way on our timetable. We wouldn't even allow Chile 30 days, okay? Even when France was crumbling and said, give us 30 days. And what do we hear now? Instead of the President of the United States saying, hey, France is a democratic country, Germany's a democratic country, even Russia, I looked in Putin's eyes, very honest man, he was elected, I love him, they disagree with us, hey, that's how it works. Sometimes in democracy, you don't carry everybody along. Sometimes even decent, well-informed people, and the French, believe me, know a lot about colonialism. They had Algeria and Vietnam. They had their cafes bombed. They know this stuff quite well. Colin Powell, even in his book, said if he'd read Bernard Fall, he never would have gone to Vietnam. So they knew something about the previous mistakes. But here you have a situation where the President of the United States, instead of saying that, said these people they're the old regime, they're out of the debate. The UN Security Council is not worth anything because it's not going to vote our way. We won't even go for another vote. What are you saying about democracy? We are saying basically you're for democracy when it comes out in support of your interest, your skewed view at that moment. And I think the United States has set the worst example and has betrayed the most important ideal in this world, you know, which is that people are allowed to debate these things. They should be informed. They should not be deceived. The government should speak truthfully to them, and instead we've had a government that has lied to them far more effectively than I've been able to do playing the government role just now.
Thank you, Buzz. Thank you, Mr. Scheer. We'll now have a few minutes each for rebuttals. Christopher?
Well, you might as well laugh now because you won't laugh at the end. I haven't got any mirthful stuff to give you. Let's see. Monsieur Chirac and Herr Schroeder both said openly, publicly, and several times that under no circumstances, first, would they ever vote to employ force against Saddam Hussein, under no circumstances, and on the production of no evidence. And second, that under no circumstances would the policies of their countries, respectively France and Germany, be determined by the United Nations. In other words, the really selfish, unilateral, irresponsible, lawless powers were the ones threatening to use their vetoes with that mentality in that way. The demand for extra time would have brought us into something like May, next month, that's to say, where the month that Iraq was due to take the chair of the United Nations Special Committee on Disarmament. I'm now glad that it's Iraq's turn next month. I'm not so sure about the people who wanted it to happen when that would have been Saddam Hussein in the chair of the UN Commission on Disarmament, but that's what those who wanted more time were calling for. The other thing more time would have given would be the chance to buy a nuclear weapon off the shelf from Kim Jong-il in North Korea, who I think will not be going into that open market with quite the same insouciance that he proposed to do so before. But that was the axis as it would have existed had action not been taken. And those who are opposed to this war, in however stand-up way they adopt their position, have simply to explain what they propose to do about the intolerability of the pre-existing status quo. And I've indicated just some of what those consequences would have been. Now, I should say that everyone makes a great play of their misgivings and their second thoughts and so on. It would be unfair, I think, I hope they don't mean to imply that those of us who take a decided position don't understand the nature of a misgiving. Of course, those of us who took the side of the regime change policy knew what the risks were of factional strife in Iraq, of opportunist interventions by neighboring countries. But all of those things were in Iraq's future in any case. If the regime had been allowed to run its course and choose the time and means of its own expiry, can you imagine how immiserated the Iraqis would be now? Look what Saddam Hussein did to his people in the short time remaining to him, forcing people into the front line on penalty of having their tongues cut out, importing jihad forces from all over the region to do his fighting for him, training a special black-shirted force. If his regime had been allowed to run its course and continue to be able to threaten the oil fields of neighboring countries as well as of Iraq itself, there would have been a nightmarish end to this. It's not, we don't choose between keeping Iraq the way it was and intervening. Iraq was already melting down and constituting a danger to itself and others. And there's never any sense of the acceptance of this responsibility in the rhetoric of any of the critics of the policy. It may well be that it may well be, it certainly is, it would be predicted by anybody, a resurgence of theocratic politics among the Shia. It has to be noticed, however, that in Iran, the major Shia country in the world, a country of between 65 and 70 million people, the tendency is all the other way. They've tried running their country out of a holy book, and they found out what happens when you try. It cannot be done. The Shia revolution, the Ayatollah's revolution in Iran, is an admitted failure, and most of its people want to be rid of it. So that's what I say when I say that the wind of change blows in both directions. Yes, there are reactionary and unwelcome consequences, but there is a definite tendency towards political reform. And the most encouraging other development in the region is clearly the emergence of a civil society opposition in Iran itself, which again, I insist, should be the business of the so-called left and anti-war and human rights forces to support, to endorse, to encourage, instead of endlessly sneering about. That would be my proposal. Now, it is beyond doubt that Iraq at one point had extensive nuclear, chemical, biological, and other weapons programs. That's beyond doubt. Nobody disputes it. The nuclear reactor was only discovered after the intervention in Iraq in 1991, and that we only discovered that way how near Saddam Hussein came to the threshold of joining the Kim Jong-il club. Why didn't we discover it earlier? Because Hans Blix had certified that Iraq was exemplary in its compliance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's why we didn't discover it earlier. In the same way as Hans Blix has certified North Korea repeatedly in the 1990s as in full compliance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Excuse me if I don't take the word of Dr. Blix seriously at all. And we know from the tapes shown by Secretary Powell to the United Nations, we certainly know this much. Those inspection teams had been penetrated and some of their members turned. The Iraqis knew where the inspections were coming and when. The process had become insulting. It had been degraded and corrupted. I know myself of someone, a very senior inspector, who was offered a personal bribe of $1 million by Tariq Aziz in person in his office. Not everyone said no, evidently. If it turns out that Iraq has destroyed, or did in the closing days of the Saddam Hussein regime, destroy its chemical and biological weapons stocks, which I hope they were smart enough to do, then that's one up for those of us who said, well, if you don't destroy them, we're going to come and destroy them for you. I'm sorry, the irony is not at our expense if Iraq is disarmed. It proves our point. And if it was at anyone's expense, it would be at those who told me repeatedly in the run-up to this intervention that if it took place, Saddam Hussein would obliterate Israel and other neighboring countries with chemical and biological weapons. They told me that's what would happen if he was challenged. Well, don't they feel any sense of embarrassment at the apparent fact that Iraq is, at any rate, appreciably nearer to being disarmed than it was before? This is no time for witless sneering on that point either. I think that's all I'll say for now.
Thank you. Christopher. Mark. Mark Danner.
One thing that remains constant between the debate a month and a half ago and now is that we're still arguing about inspections, apparently, and we're still wondering when the weapons of mass destruction will be found. You see a tendency on the part of the administration now to redefine the issue and say, in fact, the president the other night to NBC News said, we will certainly find that they had the means to make these weapons. I suspect we will find that. But I'm not sure how much it serves us to debate here about inspections. I think it's very clear, as Samantha noted, that there were a number of different reasons for the war, that when we talk about governments or when we talk about the Bush administration, even though we tend to personify it and say it does this because, we're in fact talking about a great number of people, especially those at the top who tend to be very aggressive and strong-willed and who fight with one another. And we're looking at a political synthesis that ends up bringing you a particular action. And it was clear there were national security reasons that descend from the Carter Doctrine about the security of the Persian Gulf and our need for oil. It was clear there are many people who were worried about weapons of mass destruction, the capability to build them, if that. And then there were other people who had this vision of democracy in the Middle East. The interesting thing now, and the reason why we are all lucky to be sentient citizens in this moment of history, sentient American citizens, is we are seeing in front of us those differences worked out. There is a jostling in the administration, and a jostling that will become more and more violent as this occupation continues. And the interesting thing will be the kinds of stresses that Samantha mentioned, the stresses between those who will be happy having gotten rid of him and will essentially want to wash their hands of the matter, those who truly believe, to probably the growing astonishment of their more cynical colleagues, that democracy can be installed in Iraq, and others who have their own reasons for making this intervention. My interest, we can argue, I think, about the French, we can argue about the Germans, we can argue about the effects of these debates, but it seems to me that, again, as citizens, what we should be concerned about is how this occupation will develop and what it will lead to. I tried to give a sense in my opening remarks about the difficulties of imposing a democratic, stable order in Iraq now, and I think we will see those difficulties played out in the coming days. What is of even more interest to us, I think, will be the domestic effects of that. That is, if the occupation starts to look bad, if there are increasing political problems, if weapons of mass destruction are not found, or very few of them are found, all of this will redound and hurt or affect the administration. All of us, I think, should remember that we now have a Republican Party that is absolutely dependent for its political energy on national security. That is, it is dependent on foreign policy and national security for its popularity. Its domestic policies are very unpopular, and indeed 9/11, I think it is fair to say, was an extremely fortunate event for the Republican Party. I mean, that sounds like an awful thing to say, but the fact is that the Republican Party came out of the 90s having lost its two key issues. One, in economic policy, that is a balanced budget and economic fiscal responsibility, which had been destroyed by the huge Reagan deficits and by Clinton's successful pursuit of a balanced budget and high growth, and national security policy, which ended with the Cold War.
Thank you, Mark. Not only has time for inspections begun to run out, but I'm afraid I'm informed by my overseers that the time for at least this even modest debate is fast running out.
Can I add one sentence?
You may add one sentence, and then I want to give both Samantha and Mr. Scheer an opportunity as well.
My one sentence is that to the extent this looks bad in Iraq will be the extent those who want to extend this revolution by force of arms elsewhere, they in the administration, they will be strengthened. And that is what we should keep our eye on.
In the interest of time, I'm afraid I have to ask you to speak twice as fast in half the remaining time. Samantha Power.
With me, that's a very bad idea. I already speak like the Federal Express guy. Iran, just a point to respond to Christopher, I think he's so right about the revolution that's taken hold there, but one of the things we have to ask ourselves is isn't that actually a model for vernacularizing a process, a democratic process? One of the things, as you know, that the dissidents and the heroes of that imminent counter-revolution, one of the positions they've taken is the United States, just whatever you do, don't show up with the hairy hands of USAID. You know, don't, you know, send us computers, don't taint us by association with your, you know, project, your imperial project. And if we are sensitive, we will not. But there are people within the administration who are not at all solicitous, in fact, of the democratic impulse of the Democrats within these societies. And I think that there's a sort of bullying and a one-size-fits-all temperament that we have to be very careful. But I hope you're right that we won't go there. But we all have to ask ourselves about what democracy means. I mean, the point was raised about wanting democracy being wanting our results, or the results that we like. And the president in his interview with Brokaw said this week, my preference is for church to be separate from state. That is his preference. It's most of our preferences. And the collective challenge is, how do we build not just a democracy where the Shia do go to the poll and do create another, we have to wait another 20 years for a vernacularization of that counter-revolution with another theocratic fascistic regime. How do we create a liberal democracy and not just a poll voting democracy? And then final point, I hope an important one, I think a lot of this debate has been about Iraq, and this replicates very much, I mean, it has been, that's the title of the panel, it's fair, but it replicates very much the way the Bush administration, I think, itself had a debate about Iraq, and it brings a singular, it's a quite typical American and empire or superpower feature, but it brings an exaggerated and an unprecedented a la carteism to the way it focuses on its foreign policy. So it actually thought that it could have the debate about whether to go to war in Iraq, whether on human rights grounds or on disarmament grounds, without noting that the credibility of our arguments was being gauged on the basis of our policies in other areas. So they didn't see how our position on AIDS, drugs, and intellectual property concerns, or on farm subsidies, or on climate change, or an international criminal court, all of that happened in other areas. We were having a debate within the four corners of Iraq. And unfortunately, other people are judging the legitimacy of our arguments on a much more lateral basis, not just laterally, but also actually historically.
Thank you very much, Samantha.
Yeah.
Robert Scheer.
This is what, 10 seconds of truth? Okay.
If you can confine it to even several haikus strung together, that would be appreciated.
Well, let me give us several haikus. I mean, I can't do it as a poet, but we are the strongest nation that has ever existed in the world, disproportionately more powerful than any society, and we are more chicken shit, more afraid of our own people than we've ever been. I don't get it. I don't understand why we have prisoners locked up and they don't have a right to lawyers. I don't understand why immigrants have to register. I don't understand why these talk show nuts keep telling us we can't challenge them. I don't understand, where are the advocates of democracy? Who are the people who believe in free debate, for God's sake? When is there a better time to debate than when you're thinking about remaking the whole world? You know? Why shouldn't you be debating it? You know? And on every level. We said those scientists in Iraq should be in an environment where they can speak freely. Why are they being held? And why is there not one single journalist that seems to want to interview them? They've been held since April 12th, the most leading. What are they doing? Being worked over? You know? Are they being treated like they're being in Guantanamo? So the basic issue here is really not our right to intervene in the world. I think we should intervene in the world to stop genocide. I think we should do it with maximum support of other countries. I think we should do it when it's clear. I think non-proliferation is an important issue. We ought not to lie about where nuclear weapons are, weapons of mass destruction. We ought to be clear about it, and we ought to act with as much unity and clarity of purpose to stop that, okay? Our administration hasn't done that. It was indifferent to these issues before September 11th. It has exploited these issues after September 11th for political reasons, and that is dangerous, extremely dangerous. So I would leave you with one final challenge. When you go home and you listen on your car radio, maybe I'm sensitive because my name seems to come up every half hour, But you listen on car radio and you say, do these people really believe in democracy? Do they really believe in free debate? Do they really believe that truth drives out error? And the mistake of those totalitarian societies, including Iraq, is they wouldn't let people speak, so they went down this dangerous road. Or are these people really, these neoconservatives, a variant of the old permanent revolution that characterized that old left, whether it was Trotsky, Stalin, or whatever, that they knew best how to make a better man and a better world and a better map, and by God, they were going to do it no matter how much damage it caused, because they had the military strength to do it. A very dangerous posture supported by a relatively small number of people in our administration, and I suspect opposed by most of the adult foreign policy people in this country, probably the president's father included.
I'd like to, as you can see, this debate will continue around water coolers, around coffee tables, around dinner tables, and even inside the cranium of one's own head as we try to puzzle out what is the moral course, what is the best course for the Republic, how to act morally in an amoral world. Thank you very much for your attention.
Book TV's coverage of the